thank you for being here today. Thanks also to those who are watching online. We're glad that you're with us, and we really feel like it's important for us today to take a look at things that make people vulnerable within our communities and how we can actually respond. What can we do to help people who are vulnerable, to prevent them from being hurt, abused, exploited, both now and in the future. So my name is Jennifer Roemhildt-Tunehag. I grew up in Cordova, and I am really glad to be able to talk with you about this issue because it's not only my professional capacity or career that has caused me to have interest in people who are vulnerable, but it was actually growing up in Cordova, where both as a child and then on later visits back, I realized it's not only people in Cambodia or the Ukraine who are vulnerable to being exploited. People here in my own hometown continue to be vulnerable to abuse and exploitation. And so I think, hey, here's a chance for us to look at this issue a little bit more and to see what God may be saying to us, how we as a community can respond. I think, oh, I'm sorry, I have I've laid down the clicker. We're going to start with just a short bit of video from KTUU from their superb series, Stones in a Backpack, which will continue to be a motif for our time together today.
In our series this week, you'll hear a lot about the connection between child abuse and prostitution. It's not easy to understand the weight of that burden, so we asked many of those we interviewed to think of stones as childhood traumas, hence the title of our series, Stones in a Backpack, The Burden of Teen Prostitution, a way to talk about it. Tonight, photographer Sean Wilson and I bring you part one of our series, the story of a prostitute and a pimp.
It's so subtle, it's not like you actually can even tell it's even really happening.
Anchorage, the main hunting ground for teen prostitutes in Alaska. They're recruited at places like the downtown bus station. Those who are lured into the business almost always carry the weight of childhood trauma.
The drugs and the alcohol inside of my family, feeling like the outcast at home, not having a father. There was the child molestation and the abuse. It's just one stone that builds up one right after another, after another, after another. It just becomes one big bag, and then you carry it around. It's a lot of weight. It's a lot of weight on a little child's shoulders, you know.
As we discussed, prostitution, exploitation, even human trafficking aren't just things that happen in other places. They're things that happen in Alaska, and the roots of those things actually go back. I mean, you may see them most visibly in major cities, in Anchorage, for instance, in Alaska, and globally, you'll see the most obvious signs of dysfunction in major cities, but the roots of this go right back into small communities around the world, around the state. And it's things that are happening in our own communities that are actually making people vulnerable to predators, to people who will exploit and take advantage elsewhere. For me, growing up in Cordova, I remember very clearly, I was probably 15 or, 16. For the record, we'll say 16, since I think that's the legal age of employment. But I remember the summer I worked at the Bobcorn Memorial Swimming Pool as a lifeguard, and there was nothing in my own background that would have helped me to understand child abuse or child sexual abuse. But there was a family that came in, a stepfather and a stepdaughter, and I knew that something wasn't right. Now, with in hindsight, I can look back and see the little girl's behavior was very sexualized. The stepfather did a number of things that made me feel real kind of creeped out and suspicious, but I think, okay, even then I'm thinking, what's going on here? What's happening, and what should I do about the situation? And I think Linda Kay and I were talking just last night. It's that what can we do question that is actually the most important in the context of this, because I think often we do see some little red flags. We do see some little warning signs occasionally in people's lives, especially in a community like Cordova, where you know people. I mean, it's not like the people you see aren't really strangers to you, even if you don't know them personally. They're usually people you've seen in the post office and in the grocery store. Our lives are really connected here. And further from me, I was already working on issues of prostitution and trafficking. And later in my life, when I came back and spent a month or two in Cordova, and I wound up substitute teaching, which I always enjoy. I love coming to the schools here. It's kind of fun for me to be in a classroom, to work with the kids, to invest in them, to learn from them a little bit about what's going on. But in this third grade classroom where I was subbing for a week, there was a little girl in the classroom several years ago, and I thought, she reminded me just exactly of the girls that I saw on the streets in Athens. This is a time when I was already doing street outreach, and this little girl, she came to school. It wasn't middle of winter or anything. She came to school with her big coat zipped up all the way. It was like this layer of protection, and I also think it kind of made her invisible. I think she felt like maybe she wasn't even really there with us. My heart just broke for this little girl over the course of the week. I knew, we're a small town, right? So I knew that her mom wasn't married, that there were different men in and out of the house, that there had been problems with mental illness in the family, and I thought, yeah, I'm pretty sure that things aren't well with this child. And yet, even though I was actively working with women and men in prostitution and victims of human trafficking overseas, I still didn't really know what would you do in the context of a community like Cordova. Our social fabric, I think, we're very much linked to each other, and it's kind of like Japan or some other island communities where you can't upset things too much because we're all physically here. Everybody continues to live together, but somehow that can't be an excuse for us to look the other way, allow things to happen, allow children within our community to be hurt. So I really, after just reflecting on these experiences here, I thought, man, I want to see what we can do, how we can think together about what it might mean to make a difference for kids in our community, how to make this a much, much safer place for kids to grow up healthy, where there are people who are invested in that outcome for them. All right. We just had a short break and some very important input from the audience here about the fact that there are within our community mandatory reporters, teachers, school staff. I'm sure, let's see, who else in our community would be mandatory reporters? Churches, pastors, nurses, okay. So there are people, for instance, we're saying, okay, what happens next? What can we do? Speaking to a person that is a mandatory, a mandatory reporter is a possible next step. Then they can take that information confidentially and report it to the appropriate channels for follow-up. So thank you for that feedback, because I think it really is important for us to have an idea of what should happen next, or at least what are the options for what happens next. How can this be dealt with within our community? Okay. Okay, so the Office of Child Services, there's not an Office of Child Services in Cordova, but there is one of the districts is responsible for cases in Cordova. And I guess that's where any kinds of suspicions or concerns would be reported to the Office of Child Services. Okay, all right. We're going to take a look really quickly now at the situation in Alaska. I need to make sure I know where my information is. In Alaska, we see examples of both prostitution and human trafficking. Prostitution, of course, would be an exchange of sexual acts or intercourse for some type of payment. Trafficking on a federal level is a much more serious offense because it always incorporates these three elements. There's always an action, whether that's recruiting someone or transporting them or harboring them. There's inappropriate means, usually force or violence, deception. There are lots of things that would fall into the category of inappropriate means, and then a purpose. And we say exploitation, but that doesn't mean, the purpose isn't necessarily actually the destruction of a human being in sexual servitude. Exploitation actually usually means money. This is what really is happening, is the sexual exploitation of this person is almost incidental to the function of getting money. And it's trafficking always, this criminal act is always imposed by someone else upon a person, which is a little bit of the distinction here. Prostitution, a person may be involved in quote unquote voluntary terms, but you're considered trafficked when someone else is controlling you, and these other things are happening. Now, the state of Alaska has actually just put through a law that is going to help children within the state. Federally now, children are always considered trafficked. If you're a child who is being forced to provide sexual services, you by definition are considered trafficked. But the laws in Alaska have also changed now to make sure that there are a lot harsher penalties, so that if someone is pimping in Alaska, it's automatically considered human trafficking, which gives lawmakers an ability to put much sterner measures in place in terms of punishment, in terms of getting money from those people to pay restitution to their victims. One thing I think Alaska has failed to do so far, there's still plenty of room to address this, has failed to do anything to actually prosecute the clients, the Johns, the people who actually drive the industry because of demand. And so I think that there's still room in the future for the state of Alaska to take it one step further towards making the state a safe place for women and children by really targeting the people who are driving the industry. Traffickers don't actually care usually how they make their money. What they care about is the money, whether it's weapons or drugs or human beings. So if the market dries up, I mean, it may not kill their business, but they'll move on to something else. Around 80% of cases of human trafficking globally are trafficking for sexual exploitation. There are other types, and actually globally, labor exploitation is growing by leaps and bounds for two reasons. And actually, one of them is negative, and one is actually positive, if you can imagine that that could ever be the case. The negative reason, of course, is the global economic downturn has made more people vulnerable. People who are just surviving, who are just on the edge. Some of those people are now desperate. And believe me when I say desperate people will accept job offers from whomever, under whatever conditions. You know, if you think, right, my kids are going to starve, well then you're pretty vulnerable to somebody who comes along and says, yeah, well, come along with me, I'll take you across the border and you'll be able to get a job. The not so bad reason that labor exploitation is growing is simply that it's being recognized and identified in places around the world. Countries that had never considered that, for instance, men could be victims of trafficking. People could be exploited for their labor, are beginning to understand what they're seeing and saying, aha, this isn't simple, bad working conditions or something. This is actually forced labor exploitation, human trafficking. So numbers are growing actually because of that as well. In the state of Alaska, and now I'm going to need my notes because this is pretty difficult and demanding information, and I don't have it clearly in mind. The recorded history of women in prostitution starts around when? I bet you could probably guess in Alaska with its history. Well, you know what? That is an interesting. That's an interesting question, which actually I don't think historians have adequately addressed. You're right. Probably there was prostitution that began happening at that time. Most historians would say it started with the gold rush. Yeah, because money was easy to make and easy to spend, and so as the miners started coming up, the next wave of people who came up was women who were thinking that there was also easy money to be made. Although easy money for them it didn't mean quite the same things, obviously. In Cordova itself, sorry, apparently the slideshow isn't responding. In Cordova itself, there's actually a history of prostitution. Were you aware of that? Okay, some yes, some no. I don't know how many of you who are watching are aware that there was actually a line in Cordova for prostitution, and it only closed in the 50s. Yeah, it was, well, officially it closed in 1929, but the Cordova Times reports that still in as late as 1949, the police report for the Cordova Times still has an area for visits to the red light district. And again, we're talking about the gold rush, the heyday of Alaska. I mean, Cordova had a time when it really flourished, prospered financially, and was very large. And some historical reports would indicate that there might have been over 1,000 women in prostitution in Cordova. Yeah, you think, okay, right? I can't even fathom this town having a problem of that magnitude. But I mean, I guess remembering it's a completely different time in the history of our country. Yeah, exactly. That's right. The railroad. Yeah, that's right. So we'd be talking probably early 1900s for that type of thing. And yeah, massive number of women. In fact, I don't find this particular report to be extremely credible, but one of the sources gave it an estimate of around 3,000 women in prostitution in the town. And you think, okay, I think actually as Christians, that's particularly important for us to consider when we consider the roots of sexual sin within our community, the broken things that have happened here that continue to work themselves out within the life of the community. And this, in another little parallel example, I was in Seattle in January, and Seattle is one of the real problem areas, not just for people coming into the country and being transported around, but for children and youth to be sexually exploited. Seattle and Portland are two of the highest spots in the nation. And so I was meeting with a group of pastors, and I was just saying, what makes kids vulnerable here? Why is it higher than other places in the nation? I mean, I understand Seattle's a port city, so it makes sense to me. Yeah, right, it's a magnet because people can come in from across the Pacific Rim or down from Canada. There's the I-5 corridor. But why child sexual exploitation? And one of the pastors who worked in the Capitol Hill area of Seattle said, well, don't you know one of the founding institutions of the city of Seattle was a brothel? And I didn't know that. He said, yeah, actually this was kind of a miner's station, or, it was a way station for people going up, but nobody really stopped and stayed here until a brothel was established in the town. I thought, huh. I mean, that's an interesting and complicating factor to the ongoing problems that the city faces with this type of evil. Yeah, at its foundation, the foundations of the city. And so I think it's really wise for us to understand some of the history of our own community in this area. Let's see. Okay, so in Alaska currently, wow, that's close. Prostitution is illegal in the state of Alaska currently, but simultaneously, there are sex trafficking rings that operate within the state. In Anchorage, the city estimates that anywhere between 500 and 800 women sell their bodies every night. Yeah, I mean, and this is Anchorage. This is where we go to do our shopping and to, go to the movies or the roller rink, which is really popular when I was a kid, which tells you how old I am. But people go to Anchorage for a lot of things. And for sure, some people visit Anchorage and purchase sexual services there. Now, as we said, Alaska's new law imposes bigger penalties on traffickers, but does not yet impose penalties on purchasers of sex. Alaska has one of the highest rates of child sexual abuse in the nation. And this is something I think we need to take very, very seriously. To consider, it impacts our own families. When you think in terms of just the dangers it presents to children in our families, within our community, but it tells us we need to have our eyes open as we look out into our community, and not to be so naive that we're not able to see signs that things are not going well for kids in our community. When we're talking about women in prostitution, global statistics say anywhere between 2/3 and nearly 100% in some contexts of women who wind up in prostitution were sexually abused as children. This is not a predictive factor. Just because you're sexually abused as a child does not mean that therefore you will have this low self-esteem and other accompanying problems and will wind up continuing to be exploited. It's not a predictive factor. But the vast majority of women who wind up in prostitution have been made vulnerable by the experience of child sexual abuse. And I think these two things together really have serious implications for what we see here. Because in Cordova now, right, there's no line. You can't go to a visible place where prostitution happens. But knowing that sexual abuse happens within our community means there are kids who are really vulnerable not only now, but in their future. The average age of entry into prostitution in Alaska is 14 years old. So you think, what grade is that? 8th grade? 9th grade? Right, entry into prostitution, where children wind up selling their bodies to men. And I just think, are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? But I guess to me one of the frustrating things is that it's complicated. The damage that happens isn't just to little girls. As Christians, of course, we would say, hey, our theology, our understanding of God and the nature of the world tells us that we're fallen. Every person who is alive is fallen and broken and not what they're intended to be. And we continue to live out fallen, broken patterns. Wow, that is such a good question. Wendy's asking if purchasing sexual services is a misdemeanor or a felony, and I do not know the answer to that. My guess is it's a misdemeanor, but wouldn't felony be a much better category for it? Wouldn't that deter people? Wouldn't they take it maybe a little bit more seriously? They thought, wow, I can. Yes. Oh, yes, it is. Yeah.
Has it changed?
Yes, absolutely. And we'll have a little parenthesis and just go ahead and discuss this. Linda Kay is mentioning that in Sweden, which is actually the country where I live currently, the purchasing of sexual services is a felony offense. That's right. So if you purchase, now the women is not committing a crime by offering sexual services. And maybe that sounds weird, to think. But the way that Sweden views it is this woman or this girl, she may or may not be free. She's standing there, but you don't know. Is somebody behind her forcing her? Does she have a choice? There's no real way to tell how she wound up in this position. But the man who comes to purchase the services is operating out of free will. And so it's very legitimate then that he should be penalized, and she's actually offered help and restorative services, the kinds of help that she needs if she wants to leave, if she needs a place to be safe. So there's a really good, I think, way of approaching this to say, all right, we're serious about it. Yeah, let's make it a felony offense then. Let's.
So in Sweden, has sex trafficking and everything diminished?
Yes.
And prostitution has diminished?
Linda Kay is asking if then as a result in Sweden, if trafficking has diminished. And in fact it has. And not only has it gone down in Sweden, but the law has been in place for 11 years now. And in actual fact, it was during the UEFA Cup, the European Championships for soccer in Germany. There was a group that did surveys of people who were attending, and they wanted to find out a bunch of different things. Where are you staying? What are you going to do while you're here for the big matches? Are you planning, are you staying in a hotel or a bed and breakfast? Are you going to go to local restaurants, or did you bring? But one of the questions that was on the survey was, do you intend to purchase sexual services while you're here? Because in Germany it's legal, and there are mega brothels. In fact, there were even discussions of building new brothels to deal with all of the demand during the games. There was only one identifiable group of people who said, no, we're not planning to purchase sexual services, and it was the Swedes. So not only did the law in Sweden have an effect on them within their country, but it helped to actually change people's minds about what was acceptable. So in Sweden, the view is very much now, real men don't buy sex. And you think, wow, this is really important. This law hasn't just had an effect of curbing, but it's really helped to change people's minds about what's acceptable. So, yeah, it is interesting to consider. The last fact that's part of the picture of Alaska currently is from Covenant House, where they estimate that about 30% of the kids that they see on the streets and in their shelters have traded sex for a place to stay, or food to eat, or something. And they say this is actually a higher percentage than is true in other places nationwide, where homeless kids, particularly in the slightly older age groups, tend to be less vulnerable. In Alaska, if you don't have shelter, you could freeze to death. And it does have the impact of making kids who are on the streets in Anchorage more vulnerable to predators, because they need a place. They need. Yes. Okay. Yes. Covenant House. It started in New York. I'm trying to think. I think it's actually Catholic in origin, and we have actually a slide in the PowerPoint presentation about some of the resources that exist in Anchorage, which is really the catch basin. This is where kids from Alaska typically wind up, at least from our area of Alaska. But yeah, Covenant House works with kids on the street. And we'll go quickly through this because I do want us to get into more about what's happening in our own communities. So how does the system work? If kids are caught up in the system, what happens? Well, the police in Anchorage say the internet is being increasingly used. So there are these websites set up where you browse through a bunch of different profiles and then make contact. The girl is often meeting then the caller at his residence or at his hotel. And massage parlors in Anchorage are also active sites for prostitution. Some of this information will be a repeat of things we've already discussed. Somewhere between 300,000 and 600,000 kids in the U.S. are trapped in prostitution. And I want to say, if there are people watching this who might be service providers, particularly medical service providers, these kids don't pop up very often. Children who are trafficked are moved, generally they're moved quite frequently. So it may be really difficult for anyone in the community, and we're specifically talking about larger communities now, to identify them. They're not known to people around them. They're moved, they have few options, but they do sometimes pop up in need of medical attention, whether it's a sexually transmitted disease, whether they've been beaten by a client. And so it's actually really important that medical personnel understand what they're seeing and have that, they may have just that one opportunity to offer help and a way out to a kid who is otherwise going to be sucked back in and perhaps moved on. Teens in prostitution come from all socioeconomic groups. It's not, in the U.S., it's not just a function of poverty. And in the U.S., the age is dropping from 14 down to about 12 in other parts of the United States. So 12, we're talking about kids who are just entering puberty. I mean, you guys as teachers would also know the mental functions, you know, we're not just talking about emotional preparedness for this kind of thing, but actually the intellectual capacity of these kids. Their brains aren't developed, their bodies aren't developed. You think, this is really troubling, and these kids need advocates. These kids need people who can help them. Children as young as 8 years old are forced to prostitute themselves for money, for affection, for housing, and for drugs. And that's not just other places. Even just thinking in town here, I can think of situations where you think, man, I know something's not right. And even just last night, Linda Kay and I were talking about a situation when parents are unable to attend to the needs of their kids because their own problems have gotten in the way. You think, man, these kids become vulnerable. And if predators can see that vulnerability, then I want to tell you that we can see it too. If we can learn to see that vulnerability, then we can do something about it. If we will. All right, I'm gonna read this story. Julia's parents divorced when she was 6 or 7 years old. And we started off with the example of stones in a backpack. I just want you to think about some of Julia's stones here. She was 6 or 7. She lived with her mother, who remarried. Her stepfather began sexually abusing her when she was 10. In the 4th grade, which I guess is about the same time she started using drugs. The abuse stopped when, at age 14, she left home. After beginning to prostitute at age 14, Julia dropped out of school. She was picked up by law enforcement for prostitution and returned to her biological father by the juvenile authorities. During this period of time, her father brought home his best friend who sexually abused her. She became pregnant, had a daughter when she was 16, and she returned to the street where she was exploited by a pimp. There are, we started out with this video of stones in a backpack. There are some specific wounding, some pains that Julia carried around that made her not only continue to be vulnerable to being exploited, but increasingly vulnerable. I think we saw the little clip how the woman was adding stone after stone after stone in this backpack. I actually chose today at the Salvation Army, I went and chose a backpack and to represent this backpack full of stones. And this little kid one really stuck out to me because although we see these girls, teenagers who are working in prostitution, we see their troubled behavior, we see that they probably aren't thriving in school, they probably are acting out in inappropriate ways. We see this, but we think, so it might have been when they were this age, when people started putting stones in the backpack. And then we have, kids in our community, in our schools. We don't see the backpack, we don't see the damage, but we see the trauma, and we see some of the unpleasant results of that in their unmanageability in the classrooms and their acting out in the community. We're gonna look a little bit more at some of those stones in a moment, but these are some of them. Things like abuse and neglect, domestic violence. Addiction may not be an issue for the young person, but parental addiction to alcohol or drugs is a very strong predictive factor of a kid's success. So even in our community where we know that there are adults who are struggling with addiction issues, you need to know that that makes those children vulnerable in a variety of ways, whether it's because their parents are not attentive to them or because of other dysfunctions that are happening around. Runaways and throwaways are exceptionally vulnerable. Without legitimate means of support and a safe place to stay, children are often victimized again through pornography, through sexual exploitation, and through drugs. I think I'm going to try to go through quite quickly now the rest of this particular set of slides because I could tell this is very heavy, and I think it's appropriate that we feel the heaviness because it's real. Go ahead.
This week, the Supreme Court ruled that it's not a criminal act to look at child pornography.
Okay, I'm going to repeat that. So Linda Case is saying that this week the Supreme Court made the judgment that it is not a crime. It's not illegal to watch child pornography or any. It's not illegal to watch pornography on the internet, including child pornography. We think it's wow. It is scary because how are we going to protect our kids if we are allowing as a nation this appetite to develop? Right, exactly. What do we think is going to happen as a result of that? Now, I can understand perhaps the Constitution itself doesn't necessarily provide the appropriate protections, but then maybe we need to do something to make sure that those protections are put into place. I mean, human beings wrote the Constitution. After all, there's no saying that this wasn't given from God as a divine document that could never be changed, but that's extremely troubling. The problem in Alaska is growing, and I'm sorry that the stats are a little bit old. I didn't have access to more recent statistics. But the fact that in 2006, 783 kids ran away from home, being homeless for kids is incredibly dangerous. And nationwide, 1 in 3 kids who becomes homeless, who winds up on the streets, will be taken by a predator within 24 hours. So for kids to become homeless, to not have a place to stay, is just an invitation to exploitation. Now, I think actually in Cordova, there's been a few years since I've talked to the police about this. They estimated that there were around a dozen kids in Cordova that they would place in this category of being homeless in terms of not having a safe place to stay. I don't know what the number is currently. What's it like on the streets? Well, I can tell you it's not like Pretty Woman. It's not glamorous, it's not romantic. The experience for kids who are on the streets, some are held in situations which really are bondage, with no opportunity, no freedoms of any kind, children with multiple sexual partners, bought and sold, violence, physical and mental health issues. Even among adult women, suicide is one of the ways that people escape from prostitution and trafficking. And the suicide rate among women in prostitution is 40 times higher than the national averages. These conditions become almost unthinkably painful for the people who are in them. And so, I mean, we're talking about adults. Now think about kids who wind up at age 14 or age 12. We have here some things that we can actually do in response, but I'm not going to focus on this a lot right now because I actually want us to unpack a little bit more together what the situation looks like within our community, what it is that we're actually seeing, and what resources God has actually entrusted to us within the community to respond to the situation. So there are things. We can recognize and address abuse, including sexual abuse, and we can provide training for people within the institutions within our community, and even like our Sunday school teachers, our congregations, so they understand both what they're seeing and then what's possible to do. You know, even things like going to a mandatory reporter to discuss it, that's one starting point. But I think our congregations together, if they were to commit to saying, we're going to be a safe place, we're going to actually, either we'll be a haven or we'll be a solution. We will do things that make a difference for people who are vulnerable in our community. Befriend a child in an at-risk situation, open your home to fostering or adopting kids, provide training in your church or community. Talk to youth about the dangers of life on the streets. I think really Pretty Woman is such a terrible movie because it creates this false understanding of what it would be like to be on the streets, to work in prostitution. Offer help in major cities, and staffing things like hotlines or outreaches. I think it's important for people to know there's somebody not only who cares for them, but who loves God, who is available to talk with them. And I think it can be extremely difficult. I think there can even be extra barriers to people talking to Christians about this kind of stuff. You know, you have sort of a mentality that, yeah, we probably, as Christians, we don't like to talk about sex. We don't want to deal with some of these dirty, unhealthy issues directly. And I think in some ways we have to get over ourselves. We just have to get over it and say, if there are kids in this community who are dealing with this, then maybe we as adults who have the resources of our community, we have the Lord to call on, maybe we need to actually get engaged and engage with them. Within Cordova, there are some places that are already sort of designated to deal with these issues. Police Department, Family Resource Center. I don't know about Sound Alternatives. Is it still functioning? Okay. This is another possibility. Churches within the community. In Anchorage, there are a number of organizations set up that work on the issue. Covenant House, which we mentioned, is one of the key organizations, and they actually do street outreach. in the bus stations. They go around, they meet kids, they have a shelter where kids can stay who are in crisis. And I've given you the phone number there for Julie Galligan, who is the pastor who does pastoral care for kids there. She's not the primary outreach worker, but she's there. Sergeant Kathy Lacey of the Anchorage Police is tasked to work on this issue and is very knowledgeable, although she herself, and Wendy, I can give you that PowerPoint stuff. Additionally, the Salvation Army has a shelter for battered women. They have a place where they can actually accommodate people who are going through domestic violence or other issues. Mary Magdalene House deals primarily with older women who are coming out of prostitution, but there are also a Christian organization, I guess, as you would expect. And then Catholic Services has been dealing with victims of trafficking in Anchorage, although their funding was just cut. And now for a political announcement. I was actually outraged to see that President Obama had failed to provide funding to the U.S. Council of Catholic Bishops, which provides services like this to immigrants, victims of trafficking across the nation. And it was about some of those issues about hiring decisions, about birth control. The U.S. government can't control the Catholic Church, and so they chose not to fund these very essential programs. And I think that I personally think that that's completely unacceptable in our country to try to force religious institutions to conform to things that don't agree with our belief system, and to punish them and the people that they're serving in this way was horrifying to me. So I do believe that Karen is no longer able to provide services to victims of trafficking in Anchorage, even though she was part of the task force that identified the very first case of human trafficking in the United States. Actually, you may not know this, the first case in the U.S. that was tried as human trafficking was in Alaska. It involved Russian girls who had been brought in to a cabaret situation and were being sexually exploited. But in any case.
Anchorage police say a third of the females arrested for prostitution are Alaska Native. And since 14 is the average age of entry into the sex trade, that puts Alaska Native teens at risk for exploitation, especially those from rural Alaska. Tonight, in part 3 of our series, Stones in a Backpack, photographer Sean Wilson and I bring you a closer look at how the burden of teen prostitution falls heavily on some of Alaska's most vulnerable girls. But first, a word of warning: the content of this story is graphic and not appropriate for children. From the land of air taxis and open space to the land of traffic, bright city lights, and lots of entertainment you won't find back home, they don't often see the warning signs until it's too late.
They should just stay in the village. If they don't want to stay in the village, stay in the village. That's what I got to say about that.
You can spot them downtown, young Native girls with their backpacks, their faces full of hope. They come to Anchorage looking for a better life. Some to escape the troubles at home, vulnerabilities that sex traffickers are quick to exploit.
Somebody's going to offer them what they think is a helping hand, and it's going to turn out bad.
Especially if the helping hand comes from a pimp. It begins with a place to stay, then an elaborate courtship begins.
Let's go get your nails done. Let's go get your hair done. I'll buy you some clothes. That whole making them feel special. They're getting something that they're not getting at home, and that is that love and attention. And that is a very basic thing that girls are looking for.
The girls on the streets that come from rural Alaska often carry a lot of stones in the backpack, an upbringing scarred by alcohol, domestic violence, and sexual abuse, a traumatic background that sex traffickers quickly turn to their advantage.
I'm offering you a place to stay, you owe me now. I've gotten your hair done, you owe me now. That's how it starts. And once it starts, it's very difficult to stop.
Soon there are new stones in the backpack. To control their girls, pimps use beatings and get them hooked on drugs.
It took me a lot to get me where I am now, to speak about it and not cry about it. But I can tell you I was a teenage prostitute myself, and that hurts.
We'll call her Mary. That's not her real name, but her pain is real. When Mary's family moved to Anchorage from western Alaska, she carried with her stones in the backpack.
I remember at 4 years old, it was a woman who violated me at first, and then after that, a cousin and an uncle did that. They molested me.
Mary says she soon discovered that sex was a way to get attention, which made it easy to be talked into selling her body at 15.
I wanted to be accepted some way, and I found it through sex. For the first month, I had sex with like 60 guys.
Her first job was in Spenard, and an escort service that was run out of a small bungalow like this one, typical of buildings that were used in Spenard for prostitution.
You go back there, you know, is there anything extra that you wanted? Do you want a job? Do you want a job? If you want a job, it's $50 more. If you want a job, another $100. If you wanted to have sex, that's another $200. That was easy money.
Easy money that quickly turned into a hardcore drug habit.
It's easy for women to get involved in prostitution, and it's real hard to get out.
Sergeant Kathy Lacey has many stories about that. One involves a native girl she arrested for prostitution.
She was young, but still had already seen so much trauma in her lifetime for a 16-year-old. You know, very hardened, very streetwise. She has scars. She has burns on her body. She's had broken bones that have healed. She's got a lot of physical abuse, physical trauma that has happened to her in her lifetime.
The girl had been in and out of the McLaughlin Youth Facility, a place where it was safe to talk about all the stones that she carried in her backpack for so many years. The first stone came from someone she loved and trusted, her grandfather.
She told me that I could be doing my grandfather for free, meaning giving my grandfather sex for free, or I could be getting paid for it. That was her history. She had been abused from as early as she could remember. I have lost track of her in the last year. So and when I last had contact with her, she was moving from crack house to crack house. She didn't have a place to stay, didn't have her ID, didn't have any kind of documentation.
You can hear a lot of stories like this one at McLaughlin. In fact, another Native girl story led to the big break in the Don Webster case, a sex trafficker who was known to groom Native girls for the business. So why Native girls? On websites like this one, which hook up prostitutes and their johns online, Native women are frequently passed off as other races.
She can be posted as Native, she can be posted as Pacific Islander, she can be posted as Asian, so they're more versatile when it comes to posting. Even Hispanic.
I had an Asian name for myself, and it was the only name that I used, and it was China.
That's China with a Y.
I told people I was Asian. They're exotic. I mean, Native women are exotic. They're pretty.
Today, Mary struggles with more stones in her backpack. She lost her children. She battles with an OxyContin addiction, as well as one to prostitution.
The way I smile, the way I am around men, even now, it's very hard to break from that. Don't believe the dudes. Don't even try and attract yourself to anybody because, you know, sexuality isn't relating with everybody out there. You're going to put yourself in a position where there's AIDS out there, there's, you know, stuff out there that you can't even really get rid of. You know, that's something that shouldn't even be taken lightly.
And the saddest thing of all, those who carry the weight of childhood trauma often end up passing it on.
And I have 5 children. That's where my heart should be.